In this video, I'm showing you how I made this WandaVision cake. WandaVision is the first show to branch off of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I don't know about you, but after not getting to see a new Marvel movie for a year and a half, it felt so good to see something new. Throwing it out there now, I will mention some things about the show, so a spoiler warning is now in effect. For this cake, I decided to do a 4-tier mini cake. So I started by making 2 red velvet sheet cakes, 2 batches of vanilla pastry cream for the filling, but I actually only needed 1, and 2 batches of Swiss meringue buttercream. If you would like my recipes for red velvet cake and pastry cream, make sure to check out the video description below for the links. I'll also add the link for the Martha Stewart Swiss meringue buttercream recipe I used for this cake. Once the cakes were fully baked and slightly cooled, I placed them in the fridge overnight because cake is easier to cut and results in cleaner cut edges when it's chilled. I used 4 different size circles to cut the 2 layers for each of the tiers. For the largest tier, I flipped a 6-inch cake pan upside down and cut around the lip of the pan using a paring knife. Next, I used the bottom of the 6-inch cake pan and the paring knife to cut the circles for the second largest tier. For the second tier from the top, I used a large circle cookie cutter that's about 4.5 inches in diameter. And finally, I used a fondant cutter about 3 to 3.5 inches in diameter to cut the 2 cake layers for the top tier. After the cake circles were cut, I took each one and cut them into hexagons, of course to represent the hexagonal shape of the hex. To do this, I used a bread knife to gently make lines on top of the cake in order to divide the cake into 6 equal sections. I did not cut the cake at all, I just gently pressed onto the top of the cake to make lines so that I could see where to cut. After making the lines, I used a gentle sawing motion to cut off the edge of the cake between 2 of the lines I just made on top of the cake. Once I did this all the way around the cake layer, I had a hexagon-shaped cake. I then did this with the rest of the cake layers. When cutting a cake, remember to use a serrated knife like the bread knife I'm using here because it results in nice, clean edges. I decided to color the pastry cream for added color as well as a nod to the show. I colored the filling for the bottom 3 tiers yellow to represent Vision, and both blue and purple fillings for the top tier to represent Monica and Agatha, respectively. I also added some buttercream to a few different bowls and colored them light gray, dark red, light blue, and purple. Once everything was prepped, it was time to assemble. For the bottom layer, I added a dollop of buttercream to the center of an 8-inch cake board to make sure the cake did not slide off the board. I then added a layer of cake, piped a border of buttercream to keep the filling inside, enough pastry cream to fill just the center, and finally the second cake layer. I then used an offset spatula to smooth the buttercream into a thin layer on the outside of the cake. This is called the creme coat because it ensures that the crumbs from the cake get trapped in this layer so that your final layer of buttercream will be nice and pretty. After repeating with the rest of the tiers, which I assembled on parchment paper, I chilled all the tiers in the fridge to allow the buttercream to harden. This would allow me to easily move the upper tiers from the parchment paper and stack them. Once everything was chilled, it was time to stack. I decided to add some wooden dowels in the bottom 2 tiers to ensure that the weight of the top tiers would not make the middle of the cake sink into itself at all. This is a mini cake, so it probably would have been fine, but the last thing I wanted to do was put in all this hard work and then have it somehow ruin itself because I didn't give it structure. After measuring the height using one of the dowels, I cut it using a PVC pipe cutter and then measured and cut 2 more dowels of the exact same size. I then evenly spaced them around the center of the cake. I added some buttercream to both cover the dowels and act as a glue for the next tier. Once I carefully placed the next tier and made sure it was even all the way around, I once again measured the height of the cake using a dowel, cut it, and cut 2 more of equal size. Just like the first one, add some buttercream to cover the tops of the dowels and also act as a glue for the next tier. Once the second smallest tier was placed and centered, I added a little bit more buttercream on top of that one and centered the final tier on top. To make sure that the entire thing was more stable, I added a dowel straight down the center and then chilled this in the fridge until the buttercream was completely hardened. For the outer layer of buttercream, I decided to make a kind of color gradient to represent some of the most prominent colors. The bottom tier was completely gray to represent the gray color of the black and white episodes. On the next tier, I transitioned the gray color to a dark red. This color scheme continues until the top tier, which had a red base with a little bit of blue toward the bottom of this tier, representing Monica's transition to now having powers in episode 7. The upper part of this tier had purple to represent the end of episode 7 as well as episode 8, where we finally find out who Agnes truly is. On a side note, adding buttercream and trying to make it smooth on a hexagon cake was a complete pain in the butt, and it took forever. After staring at it for a while, I didn't like how the gradient was looking. So after testing out a few things and brainstorming with help from my sister, I finally figured out how to finish this buttercream exterior. I decided to have the bottom tier remain light gray, while making the 2 middle tiers completely dark red. I decided to use one of my food brushes to brush dark red buttercream in a horizontal pattern on all tiers, except for the bottom tier. I did this to represent the look of the horizontal lines that are present in the boundary of the hex. Once that was complete, I placed it back in the fridge to chill while I worked on decorations. For added accents, I decided to make a cascade of fondant symbols representing some of the major aspects of the show. To represent the date that Wanda and Vision decided would be their anniversary, I cut a white fondant rectangle, added black fondant numbers 2 and 3, and used a black edible marker to add the heart above the numbers. Next, I printed out a sword logo, traced over it using parchment paper and an edible marker, cut my parchment paper template out, and finally laid it on top of blue fondant to cut the logo. I then took some light blue fondant, cut a circle, and used white edible paint to paint a lightning bolt to represent the fake Pietro. I also used parchment paper templates I made to cut the Scarlet Witch headpiece in red fondant, as well as a diamond and yellow fondant to represent the Vision. I used more parchment paper templates to cut eyes in white fondant. I used some blue food gel to paint large circles, black food gel to paint smaller circles on top of the blue, and added a few dots of white edible paint. These blue eyes represent Monica's eyes coming out of the barrier for the 3rd time, showing that she now has some kind of powers. And finally, Agatha's signature symbol is the brooch that she always wears. I cut an oval shape using the outside of a 0 number fondant cutter and used a small tool to make indentations all around the perimeter. I painted the outline of the 3 figures that reside in the center of the brooch, and then used edible gold paint to add the gold border. Once all of these were complete, I applied a tiny bit of buttercream to the back of the different fondant pieces and placed them in a flowing pattern with the beginning of the show at the bottom and the later episodes at the top of the cake. Before I finish this cake, make sure to hit that like button and click subscribe. For the piece de resistance, I made this cool Isomalt sail. To start, I cut a heart like the one Vision wrote on the house deed in white fondant and then used red edible marker to outline the heart in red and write Vision's message of "to grow old in V." Next, I simply melted down 3/4 cup of Isomalt, added a line of uncolored Isomalt on top of a silicone baking mat, and placed the fondant heart on top of the hot Isomalt. I set that aside to cool while working on the sail. I added red food gel to the Isomalt, and once it was completely mixed together, poured it onto a large silicone baking mat. I used a stick to add some black streaks to the red Isomalt for more dimension. I tilted the silicone mat in various ways to make it bigger and spread the Isomalt out more. I then took a bottle, Bailey's salted caramel if anyone's curious, and draped the silicone mat over the top of the bottle. I had some magnetic chip clips handy, so I clipped the silicone mat in a few spots to create a more interesting shape. I also used my kitchen torch to heat some of the Isomalt so that it would create longer drips. After letting this set for about 5 to 10 minutes, I ever so carefully removed the silicone mat and the sail was complete. I used some Isomalt to adhere the stick from the center of the cake to the bottom of the sail, as well as adhering the fondant heart Isomalt piece to the middle of the sail. Not only am I incredibly excited with how this turned out, but I'm especially excited because this is the first time that I have ever used Isomalt. This piece represents the moment when Wanda looked at the house deed to see Vision's message of "to grow old in" outlined by a heart. And due to her devastation, she created the hex using her chaos magic. I'm not gonna lie, I totally teared up when I saw the house deed and Wanda fell to her knees. After carefully adding the topper, this WandaVision cake was complete. I am really happy with this cake because while it was definitely challenging, I got to try new techniques. Let me know in the comments what your favorite part of this cake is. Not only did it look cool, but it cut smooth like butter, and it was so delicious. Moist red velvet cake, creamy pudding-like filling, and silky smooth buttercream are a definite winner. And now that I posted this video, I finally get to watch the finale. You can also find my blog posts about how I made this cake and my red velvet cake recipe on my website, adventuresnyam.net. The links are in the description below. If you're curious about some of the products I used in this video, make sure to check out the video description for their Amazon links. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll see you next time for another super fun food adventure.